My name is Sarah, and I've always believed that the most profound truths reveal themselves when you're completely alone. That's why, 3 months ago, I embarked on a solo road trip across America's most desolate highways. A 3,000-mile journey through forgotten towns, abandoned gas stations, and endless stretches of asphalt that seem to lead nowhere and everywhere at once. I'm not your typical paranormal enthusiast. I'm a forensic photographer by trade, trained to see details others miss, to document the impossible and make sense of shadows. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what I encountered on those lonely roads where civilization becomes a distant memory and the veil between worlds grows dangerously thin. The plan was simple: drive from Maine to Nevada, taking only the back roads, the forgotten highways that GPS systems seem to forget exist. I wanted to capture America's hidden face through my camera lens, to document the places where time stands still. What I discovered instead was that some places don't just stand still. They exist outside of time altogether. My first night on the road, camping under a star-drunk sky in rural Vermont, I felt it. That electric sensation of being watched. The hairs on my arms stood up like soldiers at attention, and somewhere in the darkness beyond my campfire's reach, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on gravel. But when I swept my flashlight across the empty field, there was nothing. Just darkness, and the growing certainty that this journey would change everything I thought I knew about reality. My first encounter. It was 2:47 a.m. on Route 281 in Nebraska. I remember the exact time because I was staring at my dashboard clock, fighting to stay awake, when the world shifted. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of cracked asphalt disappearing into absolute darkness. No streetlights, no other cars, just me and the hypnotic rhythm of my headlights eating up the yellow center line. The radio had died an hour ago, swallowed by static, leaving me alone with the hum of my engine and the whisper of wind against the windows. That's when I saw her. At first, she was just a smudge of white in my peripheral vision, standing maybe 50 yards off the highway in what looked like an empty field. My rational mind immediately cataloged possibilities: a mailbox, a fence post, maybe even a scarecrow. But as I drew closer, the shape resolved into something that made my blood turn to ice water. A woman in a wedding dress, pristine white even in the darkness, standing perfectly still with her back to the road. Her dress billowed around her despite the complete absence of wind, moving with a fluid grace that defied physics. As my headlights swept across her, she began to turn, slowly, deliberately, as if she had all the time in the world. I should have kept driving. Every instinct screamed at me to press the accelerator and leave this apparition in my dust. Instead, I found myself pulling over, my hands trembling as I shifted into park. The woman was now facing the road directly, and even from this distance, I could see that her face was wrong, not disfigured, but wrong in a way that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on her features. She raised one pale arm and pointed directly at me. My camera was on the passenger seat. Years of professional training kicked in, and I grabbed it, raising it to my eye just as she began to walk toward the road. Through the viewfinder, she moved with an unnatural gait, her feet never quite seeming to touch the ground. I pressed the shutter button repeatedly, the flash strobing across the empty field. But when I lowered the camera, she was gone. I sat there for 20 minutes, engine running, scanning the darkness for any sign of her. My camera's display showed only photos of an empty field bathed in harsh white light. No woman, no wedding dress, nothing. But when I finally worked up the courage to step out of my car, I found them. Footprints in the soft earth beside the highway. Small, delicate impressions that led from the field to the edge of the asphalt, and then simply stopped, as if she had walked to the road and then dissolved into the night air. I drove until sunrise, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, telling myself it was fatigue, stress, maybe even a hallucination brought on by too much caffeine and too little sleep. But deep down, I knew I had seen something that existed beyond the boundaries of our world. And worse, I knew it had seen me too. The rational part of my mind, the part trained in evidence and documentation, refused to accept what I had experienced. Over the next 3 days, holed up in a dingy motel in Grand Island, I threw myself into research with the desperate intensity of someone trying to prove their own sanity. Sleep deprivation, I told myself. Highway hypnosis. The phenomenon where long-distance drivers begin to hallucinate after hours of staring at endless road. I found dozens of studies, medical explanations for why the mind creates phantom figures in the darkness. I even discovered that the human brain, when deprived of adequate stimulation, will literally manufacture its own entertainment, including full-blown visual and auditory hallucinations. But the footprints? How do you hallucinate footprints? I researched Route 281, diving deep into local newspapers and historical archives. What I found sent chills down my spine that had nothing to do with the motel's broken air conditioning. In 1987, a young bride named Jennifer Morrison had been killed in a car accident on that exact stretch of highway. She was driving to her wedding rehearsal when a drunk driver crossed the center line and hit her head-on. The local paper described her as wearing her grandmother's vintage wedding dress, which she had put on early because she was too excited to wait until the ceremony. The accident report placed her death at mile marker 127. I pulled out my road atlas with shaking hands and traced my route from that night. I had stopped at mile marker 126. Jennifer's body had been thrown from the vehicle and found in the field beside the highway, the same field where I had seen the woman in white. But that was just the beginning. As I dug deeper, I discovered that Route 281 had earned a reputation among locals as one of Nebraska's most haunted highways. Truckers reported seeing a woman in white who would appear in their headlights and then vanish. Several accidents had been attributed to drivers swerving to avoid hitting her. The local sheriff's department had even issued a statement in 1999 warning drivers about the psychological phenomenon of believing they were seeing a pedestrian on the highway. They called it mass hysteria, suggesting power lines or unusual atmospheric conditions were creating optical illusions. I wanted so desperately to believe their explanation. But then I found the photographs. Buried in the archives of the Grand Island Independent was a series of photos taken by a paranormal investigation team in 2003. The images were grainy, shot with old film cameras, but in 3 separate photos, there she was. A figure in white standing in that field, her face turned toward the camera with that same unsettling wrongness I had witnessed. The investigation team had disbanded shortly after those photos were published. According to their final report, they had experienced psychological disturbances during their time on Route 281 and could no longer continue their work. I stared at those newspaper photos until my vision blurred, comparing them to the empty frames on my digital camera. Either I was losing my mind, or something on that highway was powerful enough to evade modern technology while still leaving physical evidence of its presence. As I prepared to continue my journey west, one detail from Jennifer Morrison's obituary haunted me more than all the rest. She had been a photographer, just like me, and according to her friends, she had always been fascinated by ghost stories and the paranormal. Maybe that's why she had chosen to reveal herself to me. Maybe she recognized a kindred spirit. Or maybe, and this thought kept me awake all night, She was trying to warn me about what lay ahead. The second encounter happened in Utah, on a nameless desert highway that seemed to exist in its own pocket of reality. It was dusk, that magical hour when the sky bleeds orange and purple, and the desert transforms into an alien landscape. I had been driving for hours without seeing another soul. Just endless red rock formations rising from the earth like the bones of sleeping giants. My destination was a tiny town called Perdition, a name that should have been warning enough, where I planned to spend the night before continuing into Nevada. The road twisted through narrow canyons, and I was navigating a particularly sharp curve when I saw them. 3 figures standing in the middle of the highway about a quarter-mile ahead. At first, I assumed they were real people, maybe hikers or broken-down motorists needing help. I slowed down and flashed my headlights to let them know I'd seen them. But as I drew closer, the scene became impossibly wrong. They were children, maybe 8 or 9 years old, wearing clothes that looked like they belonged in the 1950s. 2 boys in short pants and suspenders, and 1 girl in a yellow sundress with a pattern of tiny flowers. They stood perfectly still in the center of the road, holding hands, their faces turned directly toward my approaching headlights. I hit the brakes, my car skidding to a stop about 30 feet away from them. In the sudden silence after my engine died, I could hear my heart hammering against my ribs. The children didn't move. They didn't even blink. They just stood there, staring at me with eyes that reflected my headlights like polished glass. I honked my horn twice, short, sharp blasts that echoed off the canyon walls. The children didn't react. I rolled down my window and called out to them, "Hey, are you okay? Are you lost?" Nothing. Not even a twitch of acknowledgement. That's when I noticed their feet weren't quite touching the ground. I grabbed my camera with hands that had started to shake again, but the moment I raised it to my eye, the children began to change. Their clothes started to fade, becoming translucent, and their faces, God, their faces began to stretch and distort like melting wax. The girl's mouth opened in a silent scream that seemed to go on forever, while the boy's eyes grew larger and larger until they were just dark voids in their pale faces. I was fumbling with the camera's controls when they simply dissolved, not disappeared, not ran away. Dissolved like sugar in water, leaving only empty asphalt and the growing certainty that I was not alone in this canyon. The temperature inside my car had dropped at least 20 degrees. My breath was coming out in visible puffs, and frost was forming on the inside of my windshield, despite the desert heat outside. I turned the key, desperately wanting to escape this place, but my engine just clicked. Dead battery, though it had been fine moments before. That's when I heard the laughter. It started as a whisper carried on the desert wind, but it grew louder and more distinct. The sound of children playing, echoing off the canyon walls from every direction at once. Hide and seek, jump rope, tag. The innocent sounds of childhood games, twisted into something predatory and hungry. I sat in my dead car for what felt like hours, listening to phantom children play in the darkness around me. Every shadow seemed to hide small figures darting just out of sight. Every sound made me jump. The creak of cooling metal, the whisper of wind through rock formations, the distant cry that might have been a coyote, or might have been something much worse. When my engine finally turned over, mysteriously coming back to life just as suddenly as it had died, I drove out of that canyon at 90 miles per hour, not slowing down until I reached the neon glow of a truck stop casino 20 miles away. The research I did that night was even more disturbing than what I'd found about Jennifer Morrison. In 1952, a school bus carrying 12 children had gone missing somewhere in the Utah desert. They were never found. Not the bus, not the children, not even a single piece of wreckage. The case remained open for decades before being quietly filed away as unsolved. The last known location of the bus was a desert highway that had been redesignated and rerouted several times over the years. According to the old maps I found, the original road had run directly through the canyon where I'd encountered the 3 children. But here's what made my blood run cold. Witnesses in the area had been reporting sightings of ghostly children for over 60 years. Always the same description: 3 kids in 1950s clothing, standing in the middle of the road, disappearing when drivers got too close. Local truckers had dubbed the stretch of highway Children's Mile, and many refused to drive it at night. Those who had no choice often reported mechanical failures, dead batteries, and a sense of being watched by unseen eyes. I was starting to see a pattern, and it terrified me. These weren't random encounters with the paranormal. They were targeted. Both Jennifer Morrison and the children had died tragically, and both seemed to be drawn to people like me, people who carried cameras, people who might document their existence. But why? What did they want? And more importantly, what would happen if I kept encountering them? The answer to that last question came sooner than I expected. Nevada's Highway 6 is known as one of the loneliest roads in America, stretching 287 miles across high desert with only a handful of tiny settlements breaking the monotony. It was here, somewhere between Tonopah and Ely, that I encountered something that shattered every assumption I had about the nature of reality. It was just past midnight when I saw the lights in my rearview mirror. At first, I was relieved. After hours of driving through absolute emptiness, seeing another vehicle felt like returning to civilization. The headlights were maybe half a mile behind me, closing the distance at a steady pace. I adjusted my rearview mirror and settled back into my seat, grateful for the company even if we'd never meet. But as the minutes passed, something began to feel wrong. The lights never got closer, never fell farther behind. They maintained that exact same distance, as if the other driver was perfectly matching my speed. When I sped up to 75 miles per hour, the lights stayed half a mile back. When I slowed to 55, they remained in the same position. I tried flashing my brake lights, thinking maybe the other driver was experiencing some kind of mechanical problem or needed help. The lights didn't respond. I tried varying my speed dramatically, accelerating to 80, then dropping to 45. The lights never wavered from their position. That's when I realized something that made my stomach clench with terror. In all the time I'd been watching them, I had never seen the lights sweep across the landscape the way headlights should when a car goes around curves. They just floated there, maintaining perfect distance, as if they were attached to my car by an invisible tether. I decided to pull over. The moment I hit my turn signal and started to move toward the shoulder, the lights behind me went out. Not dimmed, not turned away. They simply vanished as if someone had thrown a switch. I sat on the side of the highway with my engine running, staring into the darkness behind me, waiting for some sign of the other vehicle. Nothing. The road was completely empty in both directions. I was still trying to process what had happened when I heard the tap on my passenger window. My heart nearly exploded out of my chest. I spun around to see a man standing beside my car, tall, wearing what looked like a military uniform from World War II. His face was pale and drawn, and his eyes were completely black, like deep wells that swallowed light. He tapped on the window again, slow and deliberate, never breaking eye contact. When I didn't respond, he smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous to be human. I fumbled for the gear shift, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip it. The man began to walk around the front of my car, his movements unnaturally smooth, as if he were gliding rather than walking. As he moved through the beam of my headlights, I could see through him, The desert landscape was visible through his translucent form. He stopped directly in front of my car and placed both hands on the hood. Where his palms touched the metal, frost began to spread outward in intricate patterns. The temperature inside my car plummeted so rapidly that my breath came out in thick clouds, and ice began forming on the inside of all my windows. That's when he spoke, and his voice came from everywhere at once, not just through the glass, but from my car radio, from the air conditioning vents, from inside my own head. "Sarah," he said, and hearing my name in that inhuman voice nearly broke my sanity. "We've been waiting for you." I gunned the engine and floored the accelerator. My car lurched forward, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I was going to hit him. But he simply dissolved like smoke, his laughter following me as I fled down the highway at dangerous speeds. I didn't stop driving until I reached Ely, Nevada, just as the sun was rising. In the harsh light of morning, I examined my car and found handprints burned into the metal of my hood, not pressed into it, but actually burned, as if by intense cold rather than heat. The metal was permanently scarred with the outline of those inhuman hands. The research I did that day revealed the most disturbing pattern yet. Highway 6 ran directly through what had once been a massive military testing ground during World War II. Hundreds of soldiers had died in training accidents, plane crashes, and unexplained incidents that the military had classified and sealed away. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what I found buried in the archives of the Ely Times newspaper. Over the past 70 years, 11 people had disappeared on Highway 6. All of them were traveling alone. All of them were last seen somewhere along the stretch of road where I'd encountered the soldier. And all of them had been photographers or journalists, people whose job it was to document and record the world around them. I was beginning to understand that this wasn't coincidence. These entities weren't just appearing to random travelers. They were specifically targeting people like me. People who could potentially prove their existence to the world. But instead of wanting it to be documented, they seemed to be collecting us, adding us to their ranks of the lost and forgotten. The question that kept me awake that night was simple and terrifying. How many of my predecessors had made it this far before they vanished forever? I should have turned around and driven home. Every rational part of my mind was screaming at me to abandon this journey and return to the safety of the ordinary world. But I couldn't. Maybe it was professional curiosity, maybe it was pure stubbornness, or maybe something else was drawing me forward, something beyond my control. Whatever it was, it led me to the most desolate stretch of highway I had ever seen. A nameless road in the Nevada desert that doesn't appear on most maps, connecting two ghost towns that died when the gold rush ended a century ago. I had found reference to this road in the journal of one of the missing photographers, a man named David Chen, who had disappeared in 2018 while documenting abandoned places across the American West. His journal, found in his motel room 3 days after he vanished, contained increasingly disturbed entries about roads that shouldn't exist and places where the dead refused to rest. His final entry, written in handwriting that became more erratic with each line, simply said, "Found it. The road between worlds. They're all here, waiting. I understand now why they chose us. We're the witnesses. We're the proof. But some truths are too dangerous to share." I found that road just as the sun was setting on my 7th day of travel. It wasn't marked on my GPS, wasn't on any of my maps, but there it was. A perfectly straight line of asphalt stretching into the desert, as if someone had drawn it with a ruler across the landscape. The moment I turned onto it, my radio died. My cell phone lost all signal, even though I'd had full bars just seconds before. Most unsettling of all, my car's digital clock began running backward, the numbers spinning in reverse as if time itself was unwinding. I drove for what felt like hours, though according to my backward spinning clock, no time was passing at all. The landscape around me began to change in subtle ways. The rock formations became more angular, the sparse vegetation took on shapes that hurt to look at directly, and the sky above me shifted from deep purple to a color that had no name, something between green and black that made my eyes water. That's when I saw them. They were waiting for me at what looked like the end of the road, though it wasn't really an end. More like a place where the asphalt simply faded into something else, something my mind couldn't quite process. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, standing in perfect silence across the desert floor. Jennifer Morrison in her wedding dress, her face finely clear and heartbreakingly beautiful. The 3 children from Utah, holding hands and smiling with innocent joy. The soldier from Highway 6, his uniform crisp and his posture proud. And behind them, stretching back into the impossible distance, were all the others. Every person who had ever vanished on America's lonely highways, every soul who had been drawn to document the edges of reality and had instead been absorbed into them. I stopped my car and stepped out into the desert air, which tasted of copper and ozone and something else. Something like eternity. They watched me approach with expressions of infinite patience, as if they had been waiting for me specifically for a very long time. David Chen separated himself from the group and walked toward me. He looked exactly like his driver's license photo, unchanged by the years since his disappearance. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, almost apologetic. "You're the last one, Sarah," he said. "The last photographer they need. Once you join us, the collection will be complete." I stopped my car and stepped out into the desert air, which tasted of copper and ozone and something else. Something like eternity. They watched me approach with expressions of infinite patience, as if they had been waiting for me specifically for a very long time. David Chen separated himself from the group and walked toward me. He looked exactly like his driver's license photo, unchanged by the years since his disappearance. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, almost apologetic. "You're the last one, Sarah," he said. "The last photographer they need. Once you join us, the collection will be complete." "Complete for what?" I asked, surprised by how calm my own voice sounded. "To tell the story," Jennifer Morrison answered, gliding forward with that same ethereal grace I remembered from our first encounter. "The story of what lies beyond the veil. The truth about what happens to those who refuse to move on, who cling to this world even after death." The soldier nodded solemnly. "We are the evidence," he said. "The proof that death is not the end, that consciousness persists, that there are places where the living and the dead exist together. But that truth is too dangerous for the world of the living to know." "Why?" I demanded. "Why is it dangerous?" One of the children, the little girl in the yellow dress, stepped forward. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of ancient wisdom. "Because if people knew that death was not final, that the dead could return, could influence the living world, everything would change. Religion, science, the entire structure of human society, it would all collapse. Wars would be fought over communication with the dead. The living would stop living, spending all their time trying to contact those who had passed. So we guard the secret," David continued. "We collect those who might reveal it. Photographers, journalists, investigators. We bring them here, to the place between worlds, where they can witness the truth without endangering the living." I looked around at the assembled crowd of the vanished. They were all watching me with expressions of sympathy and understanding, as if they knew exactly what I was feeling. The terror, the fascination, the growing realization that there was no going back. "What if I refuse?" I asked. Jennifer smiled sadly. Then you'll leave here with no memory of this encounter, no photos in your camera, no evidence of what you've seen. You'll complete your journey and return home, but you'll never feel quite whole again. A part of you will always be missing, always searching for something you can't remember. But if I stay? If you stay, the soldier said, you become part of the greatest story never told. You help us maintain the balance between worlds, protect the living from a truth they're not ready to handle, and you'll never be alone again. I stood there in that impossible place, surrounded by the disappeared, feeling the weight of decision pressing down on me like a physical force. Behind me, my car waited with its engine still running, the key to returning to my old life, my safe life, my incomplete life. Ahead of me stood the offer of absolute truth, of purpose beyond anything I had ever imagined, and the acceptance of a fate that would erase me from the world I had known.
What I did next will haunt me for the rest of my days, however many of those I have left. I turned around and walked back to my car, not because I was afraid of the truth they offered, not because I couldn't handle the reality of what lay beyond death, but because I realized something they hadn't considered. The story was more important than the secret. As I reached for my car door handle, David called out to me, "Sarah, wait. You don't understand what you're choosing. The loneliness, the emptiness, the knowing that you've touched something profound and can never prove it to anyone. It will destroy you." I turned back to face them one last time. "Maybe," I said, "but someone has to remember. Someone has to carry the story back, even if they can never tell it completely, even if no one believes them." Jennifer's expression shifted from sympathy to something like horror. "You can't," she whispered. The balance is maintained by fear," I interrupted, "by keeping people afraid of the unknown. But what if instead of hiding the truth, we prepared people for it? What if we helped them understand that death isn't the end, that consciousness continues, that love persists beyond the grave?" The assembled crowd began to murmur among themselves, a sound like wind through autumn leaves. Some looked intrigued, others deeply concerned. The soldier stepped forward, his black eyes reflecting depths I couldn't fathom. "You would risk everything," he said. "The collapse of civilization, wars, chaos. I would risk everything for the possibility of something better," I replied, "for the chance that humanity might grow beyond its fear of death, might embrace the larger reality we're all part of." I got in my car and started to drive away. In my rearview mirror, I watched the assembled dead grow smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely. The road began to look normal again. The sky returned to its natural colour, and my clock resumed its forward march through time. But as I drove through the night toward the distant glow of Las Vegas, I realized the profound weight of what I was carrying. I had no photos, no recordings, no physical evidence of what I had experienced, just the memory of conversations with the dead and the certain knowledge that I had been offered a place among them.
That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I've been trying to figure out how to tell this story in a way that honors both the truth and the responsibility that comes with it. I've returned to my old life, back to my job as a forensic photographer, back to my small apartment, back to the world of the living. But everything feels different now. Colors seem muted, conversations feel shallow, and the veil between worlds has become so thin that I sometimes catch glimpses of the dead going about their eternal business alongside the living. Just yesterday, I was photographing a crime scene when I saw him. The victim, standing beside his own body, watching me work. He looked confused, lost, as if he didn't understand what had happened to him. For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw recognition flash across his face. He started to walk toward me, mouth opening as if to speak. I turned away. I pretended I hadn't seen him. Because I'm not ready, not yet, to become a bridge between worlds. I'm still learning to carry the weight of what I know, still trying to figure out how to live with absolute truth in a world built on comfortable lies. But I'm writing this story, aren't I? I'm sharing it with you, even though I know how it sounds, even though I have no proof beyond my own testimony. Maybe that's enough. Maybe the truth doesn't need evidence to have power. Maybe it just needs witnesses willing to speak it into existence. Because here's what I learned on that impossible road in the Nevada desert. The dead aren't gone. They're not resting peacefully in some distant afterlife. They're here, all around us, existing in the spaces between heartbeats, in the corners of our vision, in the static between radio stations. Some of them, like Jennifer and the children and the soldier, are trapped by their own inability to let go, bound to the places where they died by threads of unfinished business or unresolved emotion. Others, like David Chen and the missing photographers, have chosen to become guardians of secrets too dangerous for the living world to know. And a few, just a few, find their way back to tell the story. I don't know what comes next for me. I don't know if I'll disappear like the others, drawn back to that road between worlds to join their eternal vigil. I don't know if sharing this story will bring them to my door, angry at my betrayal of their trust. What I do know is this: death is not the end. Love persists beyond the grave, and somewhere, on the lonely highways that crisscross this vast continent, the disappeared are waiting to share their truth with anyone brave enough or foolish enough to listen. So the next time you're driving alone at night, when the world feels empty and infinite, when you catch something moving in your peripheral vision or hear voices in the static of your radio, remember this story. Remember that you're not alone on those dark roads. The question is, are you ready to see who's traveling beside you? This account is based on real experiences during my solo cross-country journey in the summer of 2024. Names and specific locations have been changed to protect both the living and the dead. If you are a fellow photographer or journalist planning similar travels, please consider this both a warning and an invitation. The choice, as always, will be yours.